Well, hi, everyone. It's great to see you virtually. We're getting used to that, aren't we? Welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, volunteering to spend your Friday afternoon with us for what promises to be a timely and engaging event. I'm Susan Heegard. I'm the president of MHEC, and I'm joined by a great panel of MHEC commissioners, budget and policy experts, and our staff. Special thanks to HCM Strategists, to Malia Seavey, to Jimmy Clark and Martha Snyder, to the Lumina Foundation. Shout out to Scott Jenkins, who I see is here, the Gates Foundation, and Katie Chalk and Mary Robertson from our MHEC team who are helping us here today. I believe we have 54 people registered, so that's great. And we invited our commissioners and some of their staff. So this is a wonderful turnout, and we have great representation across the 12 states in our compact. Yes, we will soon be post-COVID. I believe that. My parents just got their vaccinations the other day, and they're in their mid-80s. This past almost year has been deeply challenging for so many. Lost jobs, lives lost, businesses closed, economies hit hard, kids learning from home with parents who are juggling work from home. Loneliness all around, decreased enrollments and revenues for states and institutions, and at the same time, opportunity presents itself every day. We're learning in new ways and redefining time and space. Getting outdoors often, and in our family's case, spending a lot of time in our backyard around the fire pit, wrapped in blankets with our beverage of choice. We decided to pull this virtual learning opportunity together because we heard from you that you're facing challenges and looking for ideas and solutions. The focus of today is a discussion, conversation with you about the Lumina and Gates Foundation's report, Higher Education Budgets for the Post-COVID Era. I hope I said that right. And a set of 5 principles will be highlighted. These are abbreviated, but prioritizing funding to institutions serving underserved students, protecting and expanding need-based aid, supporting programs that encourage credential completion, expanding and diversifying resource investments tied to economic growth, evaluating and improving system and structural cost structures. And we'll have a robust conversation about priorities and options, such as shifting away from across-the-board cuts. I remember those well because I worked for 2 governors and a senator, to a more strategic and tailored and prioritized approach, focusing on low-income students and need-based aid where appropriate, identifying and adopting funding approaches that meet shortfalls and protect higher education funding from huge swings up and down during uncertain economic times, facilitating collaboration among institutions to free up funding for other priorities, and applying new and existing aid to the principles above. One of the greatest assets of our compact is that we have a unique combination of members representing a broad cross-section of leaders who care deeply about their states and economies, people and students in particular in higher education, from certificates to graduate and professional degrees, which gets us here today. We'll start with the discussion led by Martha Snyder, Senior Director, HCM Strategist, and her colleague, Donnie Charleston. Donnie, I hope I said your name right. And I'm just gonna make a couple remarks about Martha, and I will disclose I worked with HCM Strategists as a consultant on some of the Lumina work before I started with the compact. Martha Snyder is an education policy specialist with high-level experience supporting federal and state policymakers. At HCM Strategists, she provides policy expertise and strategic counsel on a wide range of areas from finance and to accountability to college readiness and affordability. Martha is a primary lead for Lumina Foundation Strategy Labs, where she provides nonpartisan expertise and facilitation on affordability, outcomes-based funding, and other finance policies to improve higher ed attainment. And Martha is one of the authors of this report that we're talking about with you today. Martha lives with her husband and 4 children in Albany, New York, where she's put her passion for creative educational approaches to work on the board of directors for 2 local charter schools. She's a marathon runner and an enthusiastic and dedicated fan of the Buffalo Bills. So with that, I'm just going to go through a couple other things here. Following Martha will be a panel of our MHEC commissioners, and our commissioners today are Representative Rick Carfagna from Ohio, Representative LaShawn Ford, who's in a caucus meeting, but he'll join us momentarily. He's a representative from Illinois, so Republican and Democrat. We really tried to strike diversity broadly construed here. Kayla Hahn, who's Governor Parson in Missouri, his education policy advisor. Dr. Blake Flanders, who's the president and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents. And then Dr. Bill Pink, who's the president of Grand Rapids Community College in Michigan. After that, we'll have a brief facilitated discussion in breakout rooms involving all of you. I know you're busy, but I hope you'll stay through the end and help us understand whether this discussion was useful and what other learning opportunities we can offer in the future. And then just quickly, just some logistical notes. All of you will remain muted through the first half of the presentation, and Katie's great at that. We're offering live captioning, the link's in the chat box. This session, as mentioned, is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be available on the MEC website after the event. With that, I will hand this off to Martha. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and really appreciate the warm welcome and the opportunity to be with all of you today. I'm going to share my screen to get us started. We're going to spend about 20 minutes, Donnie, Charleston, and myself, setting some context, much of which Susan already referenced, but just providing some detail and analysis to kickstart our conversation before we move into the panel session. So let me just pull up. Oh, did not start from the beginning. There we go. So I'm going to ask Donnie Charleston, who is a Director of Policy and Advocacy with E Pluribus Unum Fund. And prior to that, served as a state and local fiscal engagement manager at the Urban Institute. I'm going to ask if he could just kick us off with some context as it relates to the impacts of COVID-19, particularly on budgets, the economy, revenues, what those impacts were short, long term, and what we anticipate on the horizon.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction. And as you mentioned, I'm here today to kind of give you an overview of what's going on with the economy and how that impacts your particular region. And as you mentioned, I did a stint at the Urban Institute for a time, and now I'm with the E Pluribus Unum Fund, and our focus is primarily on southern states, although we do take a national focus. So this slide here, I'm going to dive right in, gives you a snapshot of the economic disruptions and in particular how that has affected state revenues in your particular region. And as you can see, the declines ranged from a low of 4% in Iowa up to 12% in Illinois. So it's been very much an uneven pandemic impacts across your region. And you definitely see the dollar figures there as well. The big takeaway from this is that this is a virus economy. And if you look at the differences, those differences in terms of the revenues are due to a number of factors, one being the size of the outbreak in those states, the level of the stay-at-home restrictions in one set of communities versus another, the industry mix in some communities versus another. We know that extractive states that rely more on extractive industries were hit harder than others. We know the states that relied more on hospitality, leisure, and tourism will hit harder as well as when we look at the pre-pandemic employment growth rates for many of these communities. Many of them weren't doing that well. Some communities weren't doing well prior to the pandemic. And so it was really kind of a double whammy for those communities when the pandemic hit in full force. And lastly, the one factor that actually impacted as well was the political orientation that may be in place in some of these communities as well, from the standpoint of that it affected the strictness of some of the orders in some communities versus other communities. Let's see. When we look at the overall level of economic activity, when we look at the regions, comparing the Midwest to other regions, what we find is that although the Midwest accounts for like 18% of the combined population across roughly 192 metro areas in the country, the Midwestern metro areas accounted for 33% of COVID-19 cases toward the end of this past year. And so that's 18% of the population, metro population nationwide, but 33% of COVID cases. And so that's a real telling statistic from a standpoint of how that impacted the Midwestern economies, particularly in that last quarter of 2020. Corresponding with that, business closure rates, when we look at how businesses were performing during that time period, business closure rates were highest in areas like Indianapolis, Chicago, Milwaukee, and a few other Midwestern metro areas, which severely hampered the economic performance. On this slide, what we see is how unemployment was impacted in your regions. And as you can see, and I won't go through all of the details, but you can see the average unemployment rate in December was 5% for the region. But that if you look back to February, is at 3%, and the peak was in April at 13%. And many of the communities in that are, fall along the middle of that range, some at the higher end, some at the lower end of that spectrum. You look at overall economic activity in the region, we find that states are, starting to get back to the level of economic activity that they had prior to the pandemic. Nationally, we're talking about, let's see, roughly 82%. The U.S. economy is about at 82% of productive capacity as compared to what it was prior to the pandemic. And Midwestern communities range from Illinois, which is operating at around 74% of productive capacity, and Iowa, which is operating at around 88% of productive capacity. And the rest of the states are somewhere in that range between that 74% capacity and Iowa at 88% capacity. And so we look at these unemployment, like I said, it ranges, and then it's with the peak, as I mentioned, in the spring. And one key telling stat is that unemployment for the bottom quartile is roughly right around 20%, whereas if you look at the top quartile, it's around 5%. So that's a really telling statistic from the standpoint of the idea that we're experiencing a K-shaped recovery from the standpoint of people at the top end of the spectrum doing quite well, people at the bottom end of the economy not doing that well. Many of you who were looking at the news this morning noted that we got some data out from the jobs report today, and we note that the economy produced roughly 49,000 jobs in January, which is relatively lackluster given where we would like to be in this particular part of the recovery, which tells us we have a long way to go. When we look at unemployment, we see that communities has been very uneven with the unemployment rate impacting communities of color a lot harder than it has white communities. In particular, if you look at historically, the African American, for example, African American unemployment rate roughly runs 2 times the rate of the white unemployment rate, and that's no different than it is now with respect to the current pandemic. The CBO recently released a report showing that the economy is projected to return to pre-pandemic levels later this year. GDP in particular is expected to return to its pre-pandemic size somewhere in the middle of 2021. And the unemployment rate is projected to fall to somewhere around 5% later this year and down to 4% in 2024 and 2025. But a key issue is that the number of employed workers won't return to its pre-pandemic levels until 2024. And the difference being really is the millions of workers who have left the workforce altogether, who are disproportionately female workers. 40% of the unemployed have been unemployed for 6 months or more. When we look at that those individuals who are covered under the U6, which is the expanded unemployment rate as compared to what they typically report, which is the basic unemployment rate, that U6 includes individuals who are discouraged, individuals who are underemployed, and so forth. And when you look at that number, you really get a sense that the economy is really not doing as well as that top line unemployment figure would dictate. It's also worth noting that the CBO projections, which predict like us getting back to normal towards the middle of the year and towards next year, don't account for any new stimulus. We don't know how this is going to play out with respect to the stimulus plans with the federal government and the Biden administration. We'll see, and we'll see whether or not that includes any money for states. So that remains to be seen. A key underlying assumption with the CBO projections is that we will have a successful rollout of the vaccine. As I mentioned in the outset, this is a virus economy, and the virus is really in charge. One complicating factor, as many of you know, if you are CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News addicts like I am, I kind of switch back and forth between all the different networks. You know that there are different variants of the virus emerging constantly. And so there are the Brazilian variant, the South African variant, the UK variant, and there's just now getting insight as to how those variants are going to be impacted by the vaccine. And so that's the real complicating factor, the extent to which we can really ramp up our vaccine distribution and get people vaccinated so we can get the economy back up and running. And so that's a key factor, whether or not we can actually do that. And so that remains to be seen. So keep that kind of in the back of your minds. Despite the rosy picture from the CBO, even if everything projects out as they expected to, that's the overall economy. That's really from standpoint of federal revenues, it was what they're really talking about, but that doesn't really tell you what's going to be happening with states. When we look at the past recession, the Great Recession, 10 years past that recession, roughly 10 or 15 states had not fully recovered from where they were prior to the Great Recession. And so it's very uneven. And the reality is that states will likely not recover in the next year or two from standpoint of their revenues. When we look at the structure of the pandemic economy, we're seeing things, of course, like a shift from brick and mortar to retail sales to online sales, which negatively impacts employment numbers, which impacts, of course, your sales tax and income taxes. When we look at the shift to virtual and to virtual meetings like we're doing right now, that impacts business travel, impacts car rentals, auto sales. It impacts hotel bookings, gas taxes, excise taxes that states collect. It impacts conference venue bookings. It impacts a range of activity that impacts state and local revenues. Also, when we look at the work from home trend, the questions remain as how will that play out once the economy gets back up and running? Will companies stay with that model, or will they go back to the old model? We don't know as yet. We do know that could impact vacancy rates in businesses and corporate office spaces, which would then impact local revenue collections from standpoint of property taxes and so forth. And so while the CBO projections are rosy, it's not a foregone conclusion that state and local revenues are going to rebound as quickly. And as I mentioned before, as history tells us, it's likely that recovery will be uneven and it will take some time. We'll look at those states that will be hit the hardest. Those will be the states that have this challenging mix of low wage unemployment, high levels of pandemic layoffs, and an aging workforce. Those will be the communities that will have the hardest time getting back up and running after the pandemic. Notably, during the Great Recession, we also saw productivity that actually went up in a number of industries because there was a significant shift during that recession to automation and labor saving technologies. And we're seeing some of that play out right now, in part due to tax incentives, which allows full expensing of business expenditures on investments like technology and other infrastructure as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was expanded. And so what we're seeing now is that for every 10 jobs that are lost during the pandemic, we're only seeing 3 jobs that are being created from standpoint of, for example, if 10 grocery store workers are laid off or manufacturing workers are laid off, we're only seeing 3 jobs being created in delivery services. So that 10-to-3 ratio is really unsustainable. Last point I'll make is the University of Chicago has predicted that, 4 in 10, roughly 42% of jobs eliminated during the recent pandemic are not actually coming back. And it's likely those jobs will be disproportionately held by women, people of color, and aging workers. And so that really raises the bar from standpoint of how we address the employment needs and the training needs of those particular workers. And that's where I'll conclude, and I'll turn it over to Martha.
Thanks, Donnie. I mean, great setup, great context in terms of what we're here to talk about today, which is without a doubt the role that postsecondary, that educational opportunity and educational attainment can play in meeting many of those challenges that you just discussed. And certainly just picking up on there to those jobs that aren't returning, those that have been impacted most by COVID-19, certainly are those not just women, not just older, not just populations of color, but also the interconnected nature of that with educational attainment and level of education. And so, the disparities run far and wide, and certainly post-secondary training and opportunities play a role in our recovery. Certainly, when we look at attainment rates across MEC, we see that you outpace the national average as a whole, as a region, but we also know that there's significant gaps across different groups that are underneath these numbers. And again, certainly relates to many of the opening and framing context that Donnie just walked through in terms of needing to address these gaps and get those most vulnerable populations back into the workforce. When we look at this, however, that right now, another impact of COVID-19 is certainly the undergraduate or the enrollment trends that we're seeing nationally, which have dropped off significantly from pre-COVID levels, with pretty significant impacts in the Midwest. And when you look at this chart, you certainly see that this is a trend that runs completely counter to other unemployment and recession trends. Typically, in times of unemployment, we see community college enrollments spike up relevant to those times of unemployment. 2020 certainly broke that trend. Community colleges, in fact, are the most impacted sector in our enrollment decline economy, or our enrollment declining pandemic environment. And certainly this is concerning, given that community colleges are the critical access point for many of the populations that we're talking about, and certainly the critical access point for getting those underemployed or unemployed displaced workers the training and education they need to enter back into the workforce. Again, when we look at this across these enrollment trends across populations, similar tracking to the populations that are most likely to be unemployed, they are not returning to college. In fact, their drops have been higher than other populations. So all of this, this is kind of the environment that we're operating in terms of what we've been through over the past year, a pandemic that's impacted state budgets, certainly spiking unemployment, the return or the virtual learning environment that many of us are either helping children to navigate or experiencing ourselves, the digital divide, again, the enrollment declines, not to mention the racial and social unrest that our nation continues to navigate. But post-secondary, without a doubt, can play a critical role in overcoming many of these. It can be the critical training, the critical educational opportunities that these populations need, but must be done with equity at the center, equity for those, again, most displaced by COVID-19, lower income individuals in rural populations, and certainly populations of color. So how can states best navigate these interrelated conditions? How can states effectively target resources? This is what we would certainly want to spend the remainder of our day talking about, is how these things are playing out in your states, what your states are doing to address post-secondary training and educational opportunities. And I just wanted to walk through in a little bit of detail before we turn over to our panel, the principles and the framework that Susan laid out in reference. This was a framework put forward by Lumina Foundation and the Gates Foundation, really trying to reset the dialogue on how states invest in post-secondary education. HCM Strategists, myself, along with several others on the team, supported the development of this framework. And really, it's meant, again, to lay out a set of principles for how states can not only approach navigating post-secondary investments in a COVID environment, be it in increased revenue or reduced revenue, but also hopefully reset the baseline for how post-secondary is more strategically targeted and invested in moving forward. So just walking through some of these principles, again, at a relatively high level, but with a little bit more detail. This first principle is really about addressing and directing resources to those institutions that, again, can best serve the populations most affected by COVID-19, those that provide critical training opportunities and timely opportunities for unemployed and underemployed. One of the leading principles in this framework is certainly, as Susan again mentioned, avoiding across the board or pro rata cuts, recognizing that institutions, and I think this slide here actually paints the picture very well, those institutions that serve the highest proportion of the populations that we're talking about are most reliant on state and local funding per FTE, and really need those resources. They have a less diverse funding stream. The increases or the impacts of increasing tuition on access are more profound at those institutions. So again, making sure that we're taking strategic approaches to either investment or to reductions in investment for the types of institutions that we're funding. Principle 2 is really around protecting and expanding financial aid, recognizing that there are many barriers that individuals are facing right now, some of them certainly financial, and the role that financial aid, both through evidence and practice, we know provides in providing critical access to these populations and incentives for these populations to enter into post-secondary training and educational opportunities. Some of the things here are certainly focusing and targeting financial aid to the adult populations, as well as making sure that financial aid can be used to address other issues that might be preventing individuals from entering into college opportunities, things like living expenses, childcare, et cetera. This shows that, that MEC, this is just a quick snapshot of again, the MEC region, on par with national average in terms of need-based aid, but quite a bit of disparity in terms of the range of the investments, the percent of those investments relative to overall financial aid investments in your states. Principle 3 is about protecting and directly supporting student success, recognizing that it's not just about enrollment, but also about ensuring the success of these students. This can be done, as many of your states or many of the MEC states do, through student success or outcomes-based funding formulas that provide funding to institutions, not just on enrollment, but on the progression and completion of those individuals, as well as targeting resources to specific programs or pathways. I've seen many rapid recovery, credential types of pathways focused on providing opportunities for students or for individuals to receive training in high demand, high wage work, high wage pathways, but also, just removing those barriers when it comes to accessibility to technology and broadband. And again, all of those issues that have been brought to the forefront by COVID-19. This shows, again, that the need for us to not just focus on access, but to focus on completion. Again, just a breakdown of the varying completion rates between white students and students of color, the gaps that exist, and again, how we need to be targeting supports to ensure student success. Principle 4 is about leveraging other resources, particularly in this case, the CARES Act that was referenced, the federal relief and the federal stimulus dollars that are flowing to states. Again, several states have used those discretionary dollars, the GEAR dollars, to target and to fill holes for post-secondary opportunities and other critical educational opportunities, certainly continuing to leverage and align those resources with these principles. But also to develop just a more comprehensive view of the investments that you have flowing into your post-secondary training and educational system, and doing everything you can to align them with a core set of goals and principles. And then finally, this is not just about more money in the system. This is also about recognizing that there are opportunities for improved system and institutional structures, institutional efficiencies, collaboration across institutions, particularly as it relates to some things like transfer policies, leveraging online programs, more efficient delivery of online programs, and making sure that, again, systems and institutions are collaborating in a more effective and efficient way, so that those resources can not just be saved, but can be invested in student support and student success. So with that, as a very quick overview, I'm actually going to turn over to our panel now and ask our panelists to come off of mute. We want to take opportunity to take these principles and the context that Donnie laid out and place them into the context of states and the activities and the conditions and context that all of you are navigating at various levels. So Susan did introduce our panel prior to this, but I want to just reintroduce them. We have Representative Rick Carfagna from Ohio. It has Representative Ford joined us. Hi, there you are. Yes, great. Thank you. Representative Ford from Illinois, thanks for joining. Glad you were able to join us. Dr. Kayla Hahn, Policy Director for the Office of Governor Parsons in Missouri. Dr. Blake Flanders, who is President and CEO of the Board of Regents in Kansas. And Dr. Bill Pink, President of Grand Rapids Community College in Michigan. So again, thank you for joining us today. I want to turn this conversation over to you. And starting with you, Representative Carfagna, if you could just give us a little bit of context from the state of Ohio, the challenges you're facing, and how this has impacted or informed your priorities for investment in post-secondary.
Sure. Well, good afternoon. Happy Friday to everyone here. Yeah, I'll paint a picture of the Buckeye State. So first, we're 7th in overall population. We have 11.7 million people. When it comes to overall COVID cases, we're 7th in the United States. So we're at just under, I think, 911,000 cases. Myself was one of them. I actually had a pretty bad bout of it the week after Thanksgiving. We are 13th, but despite being 7th in overall population, 7th in cases, we are 13th in the US in deaths. So we are at 11,000, just over 11,500. 47% of our state's deaths have been in long-term care facilities. The other big hotspot's been our prisons. Just over 7,200 cases there, 132 inmate deaths, around 4,500 staffers infected in prisons with 9 staff deaths, unfortunately. So Governor Mike DeWine, we do have things that are trending in the right direction. Originally, we had a statewide curfew imposed by Governor Mike DeWine back on November 17th of last year. And that was done in lieu of another full business shutdown, similar to what we saw in the spring. We knew that cases were starting to spike up again pretty rapidly. So rather than a full shutdown, it was a curfew between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. For businesses deemed non-essential. Last week, that curfew was shortened after we went through 7 straight days of hospitalizations that went below 3,500 cases. Curfew is now 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. So we got another hour, which is actually really key for our bars and restaurants. So if we manage to remain below 3,000 hospitalizations for 7 straight days, their curfew will be pushed back to midnight for a 2-week period. And so after that, if we keep our hospitalizations under 2,500 for another 7 days, the curfew will be lifted altogether. So things are really trending in the right direction. We're really happy about that. You know, we're all remaining very vigilant. I would say, looking at the keys to our state's recovery, first, I mean, to be obvious, it's vaccinations. We've gone through phase 1A, that's healthcare workers and personnel, residents and staff in nursing homes and assisted living, our hospitals, people with developmental disabilities, those with mental health disorders that live in group homes, residential facilities, our EMS responders. But we're now into 1B, and phase 1B is Ohioans that are ages 65 and up, Ohioans that have chronic conditions, and adults and employees in all of our schools that want to go back or remain educating in person rather than remotely. And my wife today, she's an assistant principal, and I'm very proud that she went and got her vaccination. She was kind of back and forth about it. She had actually came down with COVID when I did, and was a little afraid to get it, but I'm proud of her for that. But other keys moving forward, we did put into place some liability immunity, which was really key to getting our state reopened with our businesses, with our nonprofits, our hospitals, particularly K-12 and higher ed. The bill was retroactive back to the start of the original order, which was in March of last year. And it applies to any claims from March 9th of last year to September 30th of this year. So we think that's going to help, give some added confidence to, to all these different facilities and institutions, particularly when we get to back to school next school year. So, this runs through September 30th. We'll assess certainly where we are over the summer on that. The federal stimulus, I cannot understate or really overstate how big it's been. We've received $4.5 billion in coronavirus relief funds, and over the past year, we worked collectively as a legislature and with the DeWine administration, and we allocated $2 billion of that to local governments, $150 million to K-12 school districts, and $300 million to colleges and universities in order to have students safely return to our campuses. So we just had our state budget director testify yesterday. Disposable income from March to November 2020 actually rose by just over $1 trillion over the period from a year prior. And so this increase was led by increases in unemployment compensation and obviously the stimulus checks, which accounted for 77% of that increase. So those federal funds really got us out of a pickle here in Ohio. And so, as we look moving forward, and I guess I can go into all the great stuff in higher ed that was just unleashed yesterday, but really it's going to be about, making, we know that our recovery lies in our workforce, and that includes continuing to make post-secondary education and job training more affordable, more accessible. And I'm happy to provide a breakdown of some of those items later on in the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rep. Cafagna. We'll certainly take you up on the opportunity to dig into the post-secondary or the higher ed budget recommendations that came forward just this week. I want to turn over to Representative Ford in Illinois. And Representative Ford, again, thanks for joining us. Glad you could make it. Can you again just provide the context in Illinois in terms of, certainly COVID, but how this relates to your view of post-secondary to provide an equitable recovery?
Yeah, thank you, Martha. And Rick, sound like a governor. Are you running for governor? You did an excellent job, So I don't have my gubernatory talking points down for the entire state, but I will tell you, Rick, you did a great job. And I will also start out by saying that I always come to these meetings asking for all of my border states to give Illinois our students back. So we want them back. And we will work with you to send them back to Illinois. Illinois, of course, is experiencing pretty much like most states, the impact of COVID. And it has caused the governor of our state to talk about cutting the budgets at the higher ed level. There was an attempt to do a progressive tax in Illinois to make sure that we're able to meet the demands of our higher ed budgets and other budget items. That progressive tax failed, and therefore we are short at meeting our obligations for the coming budget year. Therefore, the governor is now trying to push an increase in the flat tax. If there's no flat tax or new revenues that are attained, there will be cuts across the board, and higher ed will be impacted by it. We have been able to generate $1 billion in cannabis. So if any states that have not implemented cannabis in your state, it is something that has generated $1 billion in 1 year of tax revenue for Illinois. Also, Illinois, our flagship university, probably will be working with some of your states because they were busy in the lab creating a saliva test for the COVID. And so we're very happy to know that we led the nation in a saliva test, and it would be something that I think other states will have an opportunity to use. And I think that the pressure points, not only with the budget crisis that we have in Illinois, will be new pressures from universities in Illinois trying to mitigate the impact of COVID on our universities. We have to do everything that we can to re-enroll individuals that may be disconnected from our universities because of COVID. So there's going to be an effort to make sure that we're able to reconnect with those students that may have dropped out and increase our enrollment. And I think that the pressures of getting our universities funding from the CARES Act, that was very helpful, as Rick said. We do expect to get more CARES money from the federal government to support our public universities and our community colleges. With that said, I think that we're all in the same boat. COVID has put us all in the same boat, and we are all impacted by this. And I think that it has created more pressures than we ordinarily would have in any budget year for our public universities. So with that said, Martha, I hope I was under my 3 minutes. Thank you all.
Great, good job, Rep. Ford. I appreciate that. Yes, and certainly want to circle back to some of the comments that you made. I also want to invite members of the audience, the virtual audience, to, if you have questions for the panelists or any questions around the principles, you can certainly submit those through the chat. We will be taking opportunity for Q&A as we move through the panel. But I do want to turn now to Dr. Kayla Hahn, from a governor's office perspective. So we heard from two legislators. Can you share some insights from a governor's office perspective, and certainly the conditions in Missouri and some of the post-secondary priorities your state is navigating?
Absolutely. Thanks, Martha. Kayla Hahn, Policy Director for Governor Parson. Happy to be here today to talk to you about what's going on in Missouri pre-COVID, post-COVID, as far as higher education and the budget is concerned. So back in the spring, when we had our first case of COVID, pretty rapidly we became a state that had a little bit of depressed economic activity that quickly turned into stay-at-home orders and occupancy restrictions, which really had the effect of limiting economic activity in the state. So very early, we put together a task force, an informal task force to talk through what we could do to balance the FY20 budget along with FY21. During that time, we were expecting between the two budget years about a $1.2 billion shortfall in general revenue. For size and scope, Missouri has a $30 billion budget for those years, about $10 billion being general revenue. So we had quite a bit of shortfall. So we put together our best budget people, and we did have to restrict funding for higher education. Of course, that's not what you want to do in a time like this. But we did so in a way that was in collaboration with our public universities. So the governor did do a lot of outreach to our university presidents to talk through the situation that we were in and to provide support to the universities where we could. So while we had to take the general revenue restriction, on the other end, we did use the CARES Act coronavirus relief funds to help our public universities and our private universities with COVID testing, with PPE, with supplies for their medical facilities that the students use. So we dedicated $80 million originally to that, and then increased it another $45 million to also include unanticipated expenses and private institutions. So I think that really helped our public institutions kind of prepare to reopen and to make sure that students were in seats, which was really a priority of the governor. We did so, our university presidents were very committed to that vision as well. So we worked really well together in making that a reality. Since the time of COVID, trying to come into the new fiscal year, we've really recovered well as far as economic recovery. So we have been able to release all of the higher education restrictions and general revenue. So that's got all of our higher education institutions back to their core levels. And we've been able to make additional investments through our governor's recommended budget for FY22 strategically to workforce development priorities and restoring our core institutions funding for the coming years. I could probably talk a lot more about all the initiatives that we have within higher education, but as a very broad overview, we did have some initial shock. We're back to full higher ed support at this point and look forward to the investments that we can make in the coming fiscal years in higher ed.
Thank you, Dr. Hahn, appreciate that. And want to kind of turn over to, going a little bit one layer down to system level or, a SHIO level. And as the director of Board of Regents in Kansas, Dr. Flanders, can you talk about what you're seeing your institutions are struggling with, but particularly from a student perspective? What are the challenges that are facing students from enrolling and the need to support them?
Sure, thank you, Martha. And I think Kansas, our COVID experience is similar to what many of the panelists have said. The virus doesn't travel, but people do. And so across the Midwest, I think many states, had a similar experience. Our universities actually shut down from face-to-face instruction in March, finished the semester online, and now we're back face-to-face in the fall with robust testing and really have, it's really been a hybrid model as we've moved forward. But I think the board, myself, we would see COVID really as the great accelerator. That many of these trends were happening, and now all of a sudden it's happening very quickly. We've had just a trend of state disinvestment generally. I mean, there's been some better years than some, but generally in higher ed, you've seen state disinvestment. And we've had equity gaps for a number of years, not only in terms of access, but success. Equity gaps including race and ethnicity, but also rural students. And we're really seeing that play out in our state. And then we've seen pressure on enrollments, particularly now in this impacted community college enrollments down. And as you stated earlier, generally, if there's been an economic hardship, those community college enrollments have went up. So, what we see in our state is we're increasing in terms of minority population. And so really, if you think about the moral imperative, how are we going to get people more post-secondary? Because really in any time in 2008 with the recession or 9/11, Y2K, anytime there's been a disruption, people with less education and skills have really been disadvantaged at disproportionate rates. It's happened every time. And those wages for those, unless we can get those individuals more education, they really don't increase. And so if you're going to help people, we've got to look and really rethink our enterprise of higher ed. I hope that we don't just, there's going to be some need to backfill some budgets just to smooth this along the way. But I hope we don't miss an opportunity to really rethink what we're doing. Because not only is it a moral imperative for people, it's also an economic imperative for our state. Our state is not going to be economically strong unless we close these equity gaps. And so that's something that our board is going to have a laser focus on as we go forward.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Flanders. Appreciate that, and particularly the elevating the connectivity between the economic imperative and the equity imperative. I want to turn over to President Pink as the president of a community college, navigating not just the challenges of COVID-19, but certainly probably trying to support your community. Can you give us a perspective from your vantage point?
Yes, thank you, Martha, and thank you to all of those who I am also being able to present with. Good to see all of you today. Big shout out to my Michigan folks on the screen, Dr. Ulbrich, Dr. Hurley, Dr. Eisler. Good to see you. Have to get a shout out to the homies. So you have to understand from a community college, and I would say a higher ed perspective holistically, what we have looked at and how we look at this, and you've heard this, I would imagine, that this is something of two pandemics that have caused what we call just this perfect yet imperfect storm. So the pandemic of COVID-19 overlaid with the pandemic that some of us call pandemic around what was mentioned earlier from Donnie and Martha around the social and racial injustices that have been so magnified with the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. So with both of these things being that perfect storm, if you will, you can't discount one, you can't take one without the other, because from what we are finding is that they truly have been much of a storm to cause a much larger and more desperate picture. When you talk about the enrollment of community college and that the data that you saw, those data are so reflective of nationally what community colleges have seen. So it's at about 9.5% down in enrollment. Well, at our institution, we were right at about 8% down in enrollment in the fall. We're around 9 this winter semester. And many of my colleagues across the country are the same way. And understanding that that average, when that 9.5, understanding that some of your community colleges in your states are way higher in terms of decline in enrollment than that 9.5, it being the average. And so understanding that those populations who typically come through our doors, when you talk about both pandemics, right? Those are some of the very populations, people of color, people in desperate communities, that those are truly those populations that are saying with this pandemic, with of COVID-19, with this other side of this pandemic, I'm just gonna sit this out, is what many of our students are telling us. I'm just going to sit it out, wait for this COVID-19 thing to pass, wait for the vaccine to get shot into my arm, wait for some of this to pass before I feel safe, because they see such data that talks about how communities that are in more desperate situations are the ones that seem to be so heavily impacted by this virus. And so it shouldn't surprise us too much that in a environment like we are in right now, battling this virus, at the same time seeing the populations that have truly declined. And when I talk about community college enrollment and populations, we're not only talking about that traditional 18-year-old, but understand across the country, we're talking about those older students who are coming back to us for different things, who are reskilling with us, who are upskilling with us, who are truly looking to get through the associate degree to get to that 4-year education, which I'll talk about here in a second. And so what we see are these populations saying, you know what, I want to wait this out. And that, as I say, those are from disparate populations. And while people of color are throughout that, we're talking as far as SCS is concerned in that regard of what we see there. And so I would say, just real briefly, what this means for students. Let's start off with students. So what it means is what I said earlier. Number one, a lot of them are sitting it out. You know what? I'll just wait. I don't want to feel like I'm going to get into an environment where I just don't know what the next person to me has been doing or where they've been. A lot of our students have told us we're just waiting it out. But also, many of our students, and when I say our students in this regard, community college and four-year, have lost jobs that have gone. And as mentioned before, some of those jobs aren't coming back. And so many of those students are saying, I need to find something because I need to feed my family. I don't have time for this thing of higher education. I'll pick that up at another time. That means they're not in our doors. And then that last thing for them is more of a polarizing environment that they see across our communities in terms of that other pandemic. They see that polarizing setting that makes them say, do I really want to get into some of these spaces? So students are having all those things going on at the same time, which means in many cases, they're just not coming to us. For institutions, here's what it means. Funding, as we've talked about. Funding that has been lost. Rick, I agree with what you said a second ago, as far as how much those CARES dollars have helped in terms of funding to try to help balance some of that. But funding is paramount to us. Enrollment as well. I've mentioned that before. But there's another element that I want to encourage all of our institutions to think about, and I just call it when they return. When students come back to our campuses in full force, understand that back in March of 2020, that was before George Floyd. That was before the things that we have seen since then. That was before a Capitol riot. So when students come back to your campus in full force, when they are back on campus and we're not as virtual as some of us are, there are some issues that many of our students say, you know what, I want to talk about this. Having that space and having that platform for students to feel that they can have those conversations in a civil way and in a discourse that is helpful to share ideas and share what one is feeling. That's going to be something that higher education needs to make sure we are prepared to accept our students back and hear them out when it comes to some of the things that weren't quite so national and exposed when they left back in March of last year. And so those elements, and I'll talk a bit about the importance of collaboration here in a little bit, because if we can't collaborate with our partners in terms of industry, in terms of K-12, in terms of community college and four-year schools, if we can't partner in the right way, we're going to be in bad shape. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I'm going way too long. Thank you, Martha.
No, thank you, President Pink, and appreciate all of the context that you provide, and certainly the dual pandemic. And I think, being ready for our students when they do return. And that means more than just in the pure academic and learning sense. So I heard a lot of kind of common themes, even though, maybe not directly or intentionally common, but certainly Rep. Carfagna, you spoke about the workforce as the road to recovery and the role that plays. Certainly the disconnect between that reality and the enrollment trends that we're seeing, the waiting it out nature of what President Pink just said. And then certainly how Dr. Flanders said, we need to rethink what we do and how we do it, and just the need for us to be focusing on supporting these populations that have been out of work, low income, rural, and populations of color. So with all of that, I want to try to kind of maybe piece some of this apart. I'm going to actually start with our two representatives, Representative Ford and Representative Carfagna, in terms of, what are some of the specific investment strategies, the incentives, what can we do to support and make connections between those without work and the need to get them into workforce training. If you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the specific budget conversations taking place in your state that relate to that.
Well, I would say, Martha, that the trades are the #1 way to get more people enrolled at our public universities and going away from the traditional 4-year degrees. I think that getting people into trades, because that's where a lot of jobs are, and green technology. Those are some of the ways that we believe we could fill our universities and our community colleges by changing our ordinary pathways to careers to coming to the new tradition, and that is green technology and the trades. There's going to be a lot of federal dollars coming as relates to technology, clean energy, and infrastructure. So that's going to be key at making sure that we get people into the workforce. And that's what college is about, getting into the workforce. And that's what I think.
So here in Ohio, the administration has just announced as part of the budget, a proposed $1 billion stimulus program. And, there's a couple of things that are in there. One of them relates to broadband access. And we know that has been something that those disparities have been laid bare by this pandemic. We've got 1 million Ohioans out of 11.7 that lack reliable access to high-speed internet service. And there are 300,000 households that have no ability to get internet whatsoever because of where they live. And we've seen that you can't work from home. Your kids can't participate in virtual learning. You can't partake in telehealth opportunities if you don't have high-speed internet. So this administration has proposed $290 million towards expanding that effort. I've been working on legislation for 4 years now to provide some construction offsets to expand that type of infrastructure. So I'm really happy to be working in tandem with the administration on that. Something else that's worked really well for us has been short-term certificates. 2 budget cycles ago, our line item for short-term certificates was just $5 million. And then in the last budget cycle, Governor DeWine and the Lieutenant Governor realized that, having a short-term certificate, having an industry recognized credential, that's the fastest way that we're going to let that we're going to have people not only upskill, but acquire new skills and just enhance one's marketability in this economy. And so in the last budget cycle, we went from $5 million to $30 million. And then the newly proposed budget is going to increase support for, it's called our Tech Cred program, to $50 million now overall for our biennium. Not only that, but there's another $15 million for economically distressed areas. I can talk about where the DeWine administration is looking to increase our biggest line item, and that's our subsidy payments to state colleges and universities, our state share of instruction. It's going to go up, I think, about 1%. To about a little over $2 billion in the final year of this budget. Our Ohio College Opportunity Grant, that is our main need-based financial program. That's going to go up about I'm looking at my notes here, I'm cheating, about 5.6% in fiscal year 2023, but more importantly, it's going to increase the individual scholarship awards by $500 over the biennium. So that's really important. And then finally, I would say, our Choose Ohio First Scholarship, and that is, those are STEM-focused scholarships. Those are going to go up from $20.5 million this fiscal year, all the way up to $28 million in fiscal year 2023. So, again, it's trying to find some alignment with our business community, but it's also about trying to expand all of the post-secondary options that are out there, and realizing that, we don't need to have an education system that just drives everybody towards a 4-year institution, because when you look at in Ohio, at least, when you look at all the options available, whether it's our technical centers, whether it's our community colleges, our 4-year schools, even our career schools, they all really are there to complement each other, not compete against each other. And doing things like stackable certificates really helps that effort, that you can go and get a short-term certificate and then go and apply that, at a community college to earn your associate's degree. And then you build on that to hopefully get your bachelor's degree. So you're always moving forward. You're always kind of building on that type of progress. So there's lots of things to be hopeful for. And it really just takes lots of cooperation and just a realization that, again, those efforts are there to really kind of complement each other and allow the individual to, grow at their own pace.
So Representative Cafrania, thank you. There's something I want to circle back to in a moment, but I want to pick up on that kind of coordination piece because President Pink, you referenced that, hinted to it. I'm going to say it's one of those things that is easier said than done. So can you talk a little bit about, how we can ensure, maybe incent better coordination and collaboration so that these pathways truly are seamless for the individual?
Well, and Representative Cafrania is spot on. as we start in on the idea of students getting into what we do, community colleges. So whether we are providing that certificate, that credential, that associate degree, in full agreement with Representative Ford, that so many students, so many can get into these skilled trades and get into these programs that are certificate bearing, that get you to work and put you there. But a big key to this, friends, is that doesn't necessarily have to be an either or proposition. That can be a both and. And I think that as 4-year and 2-year schools work together to make sure that the transfer piece is solid, that indeed, and by the way, I'm a big believer that transfer, it is also an issue of equity. If we can't provide strong transfer pathways between 2-year and 4-year schools that are seamless, obvious, and doable for our students, access is one thing, success and completion are different things. We've got to make sure access truly means access throughout the system. And so once we have that type of collaboration, as I mentioned, intentional collaboration, where we are standing up processes that show, starting at the K-12 level, you got to get down into those students. You've got to give them a vision and a dream early on. K-12 to community college to our 4-year schools. And it's not necessarily the job after that. The job, the workforce, the industry should be right alongside that whole continuum. As those students are finishing high school and coming into our doors, we want to make sure that they are already connected to industry so that they can start dabbling a little bit. What is it that I want to do? I have this dream to do X. How can I connect with X while I'm still in school? Because I would rather connect with X in school and then find out I don't like X, so I can shift and change instead of getting on the other end, finishing that degree, getting into a job that I hate going to every day. And so we can do a big favor for our students if we get that level of intentional. I say intentional because it's not something that automatically happens. Lord knows it doesn't automatically happen. We have to make sure on the education side, from K-12 through the community college to the 4-year school, that we have that alignment with our industry partners right alongside that alignment, so that students can go through that alignment looking at an industry partner saying to them, you finish this next one, you still have a job with us. You got a promotion, you've got it, you're going to be with us. Our industry partners who are bleeding for talent will be some of the first ones that would say to you, boy, if our education system had that type of collaboration, I would be right alongside with them. And so transfer in my mind, when it comes to between the community college and the 4-year school, I think transfer is so vital that it, to me, is indeed a question of equity.
Thank you. And I know I have colleagues that are on this phone or that also work on issues of transfer. And one of the things we're trying to fix or understand is certainly the transfer pathways, but also the financial structures that will make them more realistic to truly be equitable. I do want to, we're approaching our time on this panel. I think we could go on forever, but I do want to give opportunity to turn back over to Dr. Hahn. And when we're talking about these displaced workers or that adult population, I know that there's a very specific program in Missouri that is meant to get them, back into the educational system and into high wage, high demand jobs. Can you talk a little bit about that fast track program?
Thanks, Martha. Yes, so 2 years ago when Governor Parson came into office, one of the very first things that was top of mind was workforce development. And we assessed really what we could do to help the adult population reskill to meet the demands that the workforce had for job openings. And so what we did was worked with our General Assembly members and created a new scholarship program called Fast Track. And Fast Track is for an adult or someone that's been out of school for 2 years, if they enter into a high demand field, which is of course determined by our Department of Economic Development and our Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development as what is high demand. Typically, these are IT careers, healthcare careers, teaching, law enforcement, those types of careers. You enter in, we basically give you a grant, and that's good at 2-year or 4-year institutions that offer the program. And we've had great success with the programs. When we talk about equity, 80% of our participants are female. 50% are first generation college students. So we're really trying to meet workforce demand by creating a specific economic incentive to help fill that gap. We're really excited about it, and I could talk for a lot longer, but I think that overall it's been well received. I think it's filling a gap that none of our other financial aid programs really could. A lot of them are really aimed at high school students, and this is really a need that we saw early on as a way to kind of address that workforce need.
Great, thank you. I know that there's been a couple of questions in the chat, but I just want to, pick on a quote that I wrote down from you, Dr. Blanders. Rethink what we do and how we do it. If you had the top 2 or 3 list of things we could rethink in terms of how we do and how we do it, what would those be?
Yeah, so just as we are trying to reinvent a system, and we're trying to do it, and the system worked for us. So we've all graduated from college, it all worked for us. And what I would say is, when we've had focus groups with parents and families, number one, affordability, but access in a different way. It's not just about having an institution in your community or having low-cost programs. Our institutions are hard to get into for first-generation students and students that may not think they belong. I'm talking, and changing majors is deadly. And we also say things like we don't want to vocationalize a university or college, right? So we say that we want to prepare you for the jobs of the future. Well, then Georgetown comes out and says, if you don't get a good job, the first job out of college, you almost never recover from that. So I think we need to look at we're down 13% in terms of FAFSA completion. We had 80% of the families say we're going to do something different with higher ed, and 30% didn't go at all. And so I think we have to have a real urgency to say, how do we connect K-12 with, when I say higher ed, I'm talking about all post-secondary. And then how do we simplify the process of getting into our institutions and then also completing? It's not just enough to enroll and have student debt, because the individuals that don't pay off the student loan are generally the people that dropped out. And I think it's just going to be many times we know what to do. It's just a little bit like, we all want to be thin, but we don't want to stop eating, right? So we all know what to do. It's really hard because our system has been designed to only serve a few people. And we have to really think about a redesign how we're going to serve this population and close equity gaps.
Great. Couldn't think of a better way to end this panel discussion. I do want to acknowledge the question in the chat from Suzanne Morris regarding the reality of enrollment in community colleges and the connection in terms of who they serve. The most diverse population, and they are, again, that access point for many of the populations we're talking about. I think what you state here, Suzanne, is at the heart of our budget framework, which is very much rethinking and realigning the funding to meet the needs of those most impacted by COVID. So that's actually going to be a focus of our conversation when we go into breakouts. I also want to give Donnie a quick moment to respond to Commissioner Lubbers' question regarding, the budget conditions in states, and that, the data that we presented probably does not reflect the reality that you laid out in terms of, we have seen an uptick in terms of revenues in the past couple of months.
Most definitely, yes. That is definitely something I did not touch on. That in particular, the Midwestern states have seen an uptick with respect to the revenues, which is reflects a general uptick across the country with respect to revenues coming into states. My focus is really on, what's coming down the pipeline from the standpoint of later this year and next year, and just comparing that rosy scenario to, what may be more realistic for states and counties as we look forward. But to your point, you are correct that there was an uptick for Midwestern states at the last quarter of last year.
Great. Excellent. Well, I want to once again thank the panelists for joining us today. President Pink, Dr. Flanders, Dr. Hahn, Representative Carfagna, and I know Representative Ford had to step away. Appreciate the robust discussion and the many threads you gave for us to pull on as we go into breakout. With that, we are going to go into breakout, and I'm going to turn it over to Katie to direct you on how this is going to work, the magic button she's going to push to get us all into our rooms.
Hi, I'm going to go ahead and open those breakout rooms. So it should just push you into a room. If it doesn't, you'll see a pop-up button that says join. So go ahead and click that, and we'll read.
We're going to breakout rooms, but then we'll quickly gather at the end. And I think the purpose of the breakouts is just to get your reaction to the panel discussion and gather any thoughts that you might have to guide us forward. But we will get together briefly back at the end, correct?
Correct. We'll reconvene at the end. So, all right, give me 1 second. All right, they're all open. We'll see you in a little while. Welcome back, everyone. I think we are all back.
Great. Yep. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie. And for everybody, my name is Melinda. I am a Senior Director at HCM Strategists, working with Martha and several other colleagues that have just led your breakout session. So it's great to see everybody's faces, and welcome back to the big room. As we close out here, I'm going to ask to do a couple things. One is we're going to post a poll for you all to respond to. It is the 5 principles that Martha walked through earlier today, and you may have gotten into discussion about them in your breakout sessions. And we just ask if you wanted to just reflect on those, and if you have any interest in actually having a subsequent sort of learning opportunity around those principles. We just ask that you sort of select the ones that are of particular interest to you, and that'll help us in planning going forward. At the same time, while you're considering those, there was some MHEC staff members in each of our groups, and I'm going to ask them each to just give a high-level, quick takeaway from your conversations. So I'm going to start with Erin from the breakout room that I was in. Erin, do you want to offer your overall takeaway?
Hello, everyone. Well, our group had a robust discussion on these questions, representing Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And I think one takeaway is the group emphasized the importance of focusing investments in areas that address not only the transition to adapting to the pandemic, but also returning to the earlier comment about this dual pandemic, focusing on equity and affordability for disadvantaged groups, including expansions and investments in areas such as mental health, and investments that would address longstanding issues in food and housing security. Also mentioned was the importance of when focusing on funding institutions in ways that address those issues, looking at where they're located. So, for example, in Michigan, there's one challenge is that community colleges are not always located in areas where they're most needed, in this case, rural areas. So thinking more about not only the solution as far as sustaining institutions as they are, but also how their services can be expanded to address equity issues.
Great, thank you, Erin. How about Jenny Parks?
Hi, in our group, we had Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana represented. And there were a number of good conversations, particularly about Principles 1 and Principles 5. But as I go through them and I try to pull something together thematically, I think what I was hearing was a lot about the disconnect and the dissonance between what we're doing now and what we've been doing since March, and obviously historically, but then also what's coming in the future. This idea that perhaps the worst is yet to come. We've got 12 years now of K-12 folks who've been interrupted and impacted at a certain level. And we also just don't know what the changes that we are making now are going to have in the economy and in higher ed in the future. And so we need to have some flexibility there. And we need to have an investment to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the fact that this is a long-term impact and recovery and a sea change of unprecedented proportion. So again, people not quite having a full grasp of the implications and how best to proceed.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Rob Trembath, sorry.
Pretty good. So our group had Minnesota, South Dakota, and Iowa. And for the most part, they were, in Minnesota, for example, the budget was just, the governor's budget was just presented, and pleased to see that what we talked about today aligns fairly well with what the governor's budget proposed. So we were happy about that. We did also talk about the, how institutions are doing in this COVID, and they're trying to just get by, I guess, is one thing, but they're also seeing it as an opportunity to look at ways to be more efficient. And they believe that this pandemic did accelerate that, and good lessons learned from that. And I think the other thing then that the group was talked about was the two pandemics, and particularly the urban-rural differences and the way they look at that. And but we felt, it was kind of stated that it really would be this is a great opportunity for universities to model what respective discourse should really be like. So.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to those staff members for pulling together those very, very quick takeaways from your conversations. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Heegard again to maybe give your closing thoughts from your session, from your breakout, but then to close us out for the day. We hope that everybody found this to be useful and informative for you all, and give you some more information to think about. But with that, I'm going to turn it to Susan.
All right, I got to turn my light up here. Anyway, thanks for hanging with us. We really appreciate this, especially on a Friday afternoon, but sometimes it's hard for me even to know what day it is. So that's one good thing, right? In our session, we had folks from Nebraska, Michigan, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Illinois. And one of the things, I think the theme that sort of resonated with me, and I think Blake touched on this in his comments earlier, is seeing COVID as sort of this opportunity and accelerator. There was a great hunger for ideas and solutions. So most people really enjoyed this, but they said, okay, we need more ideas and strategies. One of our folks talked about, we can't do anything unless the K-12 folks the students are educated. So making sure that there's a connection there and there's an awareness there and alignment is critical. One of the ideas that's shown up is this test optional situation, but you got to do it for the right reasons, the people in our group thought, and please correct me if I'm wrong, group, not to boost enrollment, but to make sure that we're addressing equity gaps and those challenges. That's the reason to do it. I see Cassandra nodding her head. Thank you, Cassandra and Randy on that one. And then we also, talked about direct enrollment, enrolling students directly. Governor Walz has a brand new proposal in that department, and South Dakota's been doing that for some time. So that was another idea, but folks hungry for ideas. All right, with that, I'm mindful of time. I want to just thank all of you for joining us today. And here's a little more information. And Malia and Martha, please add to anything I'm forgetting here. We're going to be following up with you regarding a webinar series. If there's some additional follow-ups to this, I think, we'd be focusing on strategies and solutions and ideas if we follow up on anything. And we also have heard from folks that there is interest in the issues of mental health, issues of access, and then prison education. And so those are some things that we may think about as additional webinar opportunities in the future. let's see. I want to make sure that you take the post-event survey that will be provided in an email to you after the webinar. I know it's a hassle, but just get her done, please, for our sake, so that we can serve you. And then I don't think, am I forgetting anything, Malia? I've got these notes here, but I don't know if I hit everything that you wanted me to cover. How was that?
As far as I was concerned, you hit everything to be covered. So just thanking everybody for your time today and looking forward to your feedback and working further, of course, with MEC and supporting more virtual learning opportunities here going forward.
Yeah, thanks to your team. Thanks, Donnie. Thank you, everybody. And it's great to see everyone, even if you're virtual. It's fun to see all your faces in different parts of the Midwest. Have a great weekend and stay healthy. Get your vaccine.